The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Florence as walked slowly toward the palazzo, his mind heavy with the weight of recent events. The year was 1512, and the world he had known, the republican ideals he had served, the carefully constructed political alliances he had helped forge, lay in ruins around him. The Medici had returned to power, sweeping away 2 decades of republican government with the efficiency of a winter storm clearing autumn leaves. As he passed the familiar landmarks of his beloved city, found himself grappling with a question that would consume the remainder of his life. Why do good intentions so often lead to catastrophic consequences, while those who employ ruthless methods seem to achieve lasting stability and prosperity? This paradox, which would later be dismissed by his critics as cynical opportunism, represented something far more profound, a brutal recognition that the relationship between moral virtue and political effectiveness exists in a state of perpetual tension. The conventional wisdom of his time, deeply rooted in Christian theology and classical philosophy, suggested that virtue and success were naturally aligned. Good rulers, acting with justice, temperance, and compassion, would naturally create good governments that served the common welfare. Evil rulers, driven by ambition, cruelty, and selfishness, would inevitably face divine retribution or popular uprising. This comforting narrative provided moral clarity in an uncertain world, offering the promise that righteousness would ultimately triumph over wickedness. Yet's careful observation of political reality told a different story entirely. He had witnessed firsthand how a man of extraordinary cruelty and deception had brought unprecedented peace and order to the region through methods that would horrify any conventional moralist. He had seen how the gentle, scholarly, a man of unquestionable personal virtue, had proven incapable of defending the Florentine Republic against its enemies, ultimately leading to the very destruction he had sought to prevent through his adherence to moral principles. These observations forced to confront an uncomfortable truth that would reshape political thought for centuries to come. The qualities that make someone a good person are often fundamentally incompatible with the qualities that make someone an effective ruler. This insight, which he would later articulate in The Prince, represented not a celebration of evil, but a tragic recognition of the moral costs inherent in political leadership. The roots of this dilemma extend far deeper than mere political strategy. They touch upon fundamental questions about human nature, the purpose of government, and the relationship between individual conscience and collective welfare. In a world where resources are scarce, interests conflict, and human nature includes both nobility and selfishness, the maintenance of peace and order often requires actions that violate our deepest moral intuitions. Consider the paradigmatic case of the ruler who must choose between keeping a promise that will lead to the destruction of his state and breaking his word to preserve the lives and welfare of his subjects. The moralist would insist that the promise must be kept regardless of consequences, arguing that the integrity of moral principles transcends immediate practical concerns. The pragmatist might argue for breaking the promise, focusing solely on the utilitarian calculation of minimizing overall harm. Genius lay in recognizing that both perspectives, while internally consistent, failed to grasp the full complexity of the moral landscape in which political action takes place. The ruler who keeps his promise may preserve his personal virtue while enabling massive suffering that could have been prevented. The ruler who breaks his promise may prevent immediate harm while undermining the foundations of trust upon which all future political cooperation depends. This fundamental tension becomes even more pronounced when we examine the historical record with honest eyes. The leaders who have achieved the most lasting and beneficial transformations of human society have rarely been those who adhered most strictly to conventional moral standards. Moses, according to biblical accounts, was a murderer who killed an Egyptian overseer. Alexander the Great conquered much of the known world through campaigns of extraordinary brutality, yet his conquests facilitated unprecedented cultural and intellectual exchange. Julius Caesar destroyed the Roman Republic through actions that were clearly treasonous, yet his reforms laid the foundation for centuries of Roman peace and prosperity. More troubling still, those leaders who have most scrupulously observed conventional moral standards have often presided over periods of decline, weakness, and ultimate catastrophe. The last emperors of Byzantium were noted for their piety and personal virtue. Yet their inflexibility and unwillingness to make necessary compromises contributed to the fall of an empire that had survived for over 1,000 years. The Russian Tsar Nicholas II was by all accounts a devoted family man and sincere Christian, yet his inability to adapt to changing political realities led directly to a revolution that cost millions of lives. These patterns suggest something far more disturbing than simple historical coincidence. They point toward a structural conflict between the demands of moral virtue and the requirements of effective governance that cannot be resolved through good intentions or clever reasoning. This conflict arises from several fundamental sources that identified with remarkable clarity. The first source of tension lies in the different temporal perspectives required for moral and political judgment. Moral principles are typically absolute and timeless, providing clear guidance regardless of changing circumstances. Political effectiveness, however, requires constant adaptation to shifting conditions, emerging threats, and evolving opportunities. The ruler who rigidly adheres to moral principles may find himself unable to respond effectively to novel challenges that require innovative solutions. The second source of tension emerges from the collective action problems inherent in human society. Individual moral behavior assumes that others will reciprocate virtuous actions, creating a system of mutual cooperation and trust. Political leadership, however, must account for the reality that not all actors will behave virtuously, and that the failure to prepare for treachery and aggression can lead to the destruction of the very communities that moral behavior is meant to protect. The third and perhaps most fundamental source of tension stems from the different standards of responsibility that apply to private individuals and public officials. A private citizen is primarily responsible for his own moral state and the direct consequences of his actions. A ruler, however, bears responsibility for the welfare of entire populations, including future generations who will be affected by decisions made today. This expanded scope of responsibility may require actions that would be unconscionable for a private individual, but are necessary for the preservation of the common good. His recognition of these tensions led him to develop what might be called a tragic view of political leadership. In this view, effective rulers must be prepared to sacrifice their personal virtue for the greater good of their subjects, accepting the burden of moral corruption as the price of political effectiveness. This sacrifice is not celebrated or minimized, but recognized as a genuine tragedy, a necessary evil that reflects the fallen nature of the world rather than any deficiency in moral understanding. This tragic perspective helps explain why reserved his highest admiration not for rulers who successfully avoided moral compromise, but for those who bore the burden of necessary evil with full awareness of its costs. Despite his cruelty and deception, earns respect because he understood that his methods, while morally reprehensible, were necessary to bring peace and order to a region torn by constant warfare and political chaos. The modern reader, raised on democratic ideals and human rights doctrines, may find this perspective deeply troubling. We have been taught to believe that moral progress and political progress are necessarily aligned, that the expansion of democratic participation and the protection of individual rights represent an unqualified advance in human civilization. From this perspective, insights appear to threaten the moral foundations of legitimate government. Yet honest examination of even democratic governments reveals that the tensions identified have not been resolved, but merely displaced and obscured. Modern democratic leaders routinely face situations where adherence to moral principles would lead to catastrophic consequences for their citizens. They may be forced to ally with dictatorial regimes to prevent greater evils, to employ deception in international negotiations to protect national interests, or to authorize actions in wartime that would be criminal in peacetime. The difference between modern democratic leaders and princes is not that the former have transcended the need for morally questionable actions, but that they have developed sophisticated mechanisms for diffusing responsibility and maintaining plausible deniability. The institutional structures of democratic government, with their complex systems of checks and balances, committee oversight, and bureaucratic implementation, allow leaders to achieve necessary but morally problematic outcomes while maintaining a public posture of moral rectitude. This institutionalized hypocrisy may serve important political functions by preserving public faith in moral governance while allowing for necessary flexibility in practice. However, it also creates its own dangers by obscuring the true costs of political action and preventing honest public debate about the moral dilemmas inherent in governance. When citizens believe their leaders are acting purely from moral motives, they may be less vigilant about holding those leaders accountable for the consequences of their actions. The contemporary relevance of insights becomes particularly apparent when we examine the foreign policy challenges facing democratic nations in an interconnected but morally diverse world. Consider the dilemmas faced by Western democracies in their relationships with authoritarian regimes that control vital resources or occupy strategic geographic positions. Pure moral consistency would require complete isolation from such regimes, regardless of the economic and security costs to democratic populations. Yet this approach often proves self-defeating in practice. Economic sanctions designed to punish authoritarian governments frequently harm ordinary citizens more than their rulers, while complete isolation may reduce democratic influence over authoritarian behavior. Engagement with morally problematic regimes, while compromising democratic principles, may provide opportunities to moderate authoritarian behavior and protect vulnerable populations. The challenge becomes even more complex when democratic governments must choose between competing moral values that cannot be simultaneously maximized. The commitment to human rights may conflict with the principle of national sovereignty, as in cases where intervention to prevent genocide or ethnic cleansing requires violating international law. The commitment to democratic self-determination may conflict with the protection of minority rights, as in cases where democratic majorities vote to restrict the freedoms of unpopular groups. These dilemmas reveal that central insight extends far beyond the specific context of Renaissance Italian politics. The tension between moral virtue and effective governance reflects deeper contradictions in the human condition that cannot be resolved through institutional design or moral education alone. They require what's called a complex blend of moral understanding, practical wisdom, and the courage to act decisively in morally ambiguous situations. This concept represents perhaps his most important contribution to political thought, though it is also his most misunderstood. Modern readers often interpret as simple pragmatism or amoral effectiveness, missing the moral complexity that embedded in the concept. True requires not the abandonment of moral considerations, but their integration with practical necessities in ways that minimize overall harm while achieving essential political objectives. The ruler possessed of understands that moral principles provide crucial guidance for political action, but cannot serve as inflexible rules that admit no exceptions. Such a ruler will prefer honest dealing to deception, mercy to cruelty, and peace to war, but will be prepared to employ deception, cruelty, and violence when these methods are necessary to prevent greater evils or achieve essential goods. Crucially, the employment of morally questionable methods does not reflect a deficiency in moral understanding, but its refinement and deepening. The ruler who employs cruelty to prevent war, deception to maintain peace, or violence to protect the innocent acts from a moral understanding that encompasses the full range of human welfare rather than focusing narrowly on the purity of individual actions. This perspective requires a fundamental reorientation of how we think about moral responsibility in political contexts. Instead of judging political actions primarily by their conformity to abstract moral principles, we must evaluate them based on their consequences for human welfare, their necessity given available alternatives, and their proportionality to the ends they seek to achieve. Such an approach does not abandon moral standards, but makes them more demanding rather than less. It requires political leaders to develop sophisticated judgment about complex causal relationships, deep empathy for diverse human experiences, and the intellectual honesty to acknowledge when their preferred solutions may cause more harm than good. It demands not less moral reflection, but more, a willingness to grapple with tragic choices that admit no purely satisfying resolution. The historical examples that cited in support of his arguments remain compelling precisely because they illustrate how this more complex form of moral reasoning operates in practice. When employed ruthless methods to pacify he was not simply pursuing personal ambition, but responding to a genuine humanitarian crisis. The region had been devastated by years of warfare between competing factions, with ordinary citizens bearing the primary costs of political instability. Traditional moral approaches to this situation would have focused on the means employed rather than the ends achieved. They would have condemned cruelty and deception while paying insufficient attention to the peace and prosperity that his methods made possible. This analysis, by contrast, forced readers to confront the uncomfortable reality that the prevention of greater suffering sometimes requires the infliction of lesser suffering, and that those willing to bear the moral burden of such actions may serve the common good more effectively than those who maintain their moral purity by avoiding difficult choices. The psychological costs of this approach should not be underestimated. The leader who accepts insights must live with the knowledge that their actions, however necessary, have violated moral principles that they continue to recognize as valid. They cannot take refuge in ideological systems that redefine evil as good or justify harmful actions through abstract theoretical constructs. They must accept the tragic reality that serving the common good sometimes requires sacrificing personal virtue. This psychological burden helps explain why truly effective political leaders are often melancholy figures who derive little personal satisfaction from their achievements. They understand the costs of their actions in ways that their subjects typically cannot, bearing the weight of necessary compromises that enable others to maintain their moral innocence. The loneliness of such leadership represents not an accident of political life, but an essential feature of governance in a fallen world. Modern democratic institutions have attempted to address this problem by distributing the burden of morally problematic decisions across multiple actors and institutional levels. Congressional authorization for military action, judicial review of executive decisions, and bureaucratic implementation of policy directives all serve to diffuse responsibility in ways that may reduce the psychological costs for individual leaders while maintaining democratic accountability. Yet this institutional diffusion of responsibility creates its own moral hazards by making it more difficult to identify who bears ultimate responsibility for political outcomes. When harmful consequences result from complex institutional processes involving multiple decision-makers, it becomes nearly impossible to hold any single individual accountable for the moral costs of political action. This diffusion may reduce the psychological burden on political leaders, while increasing the overall moral cost of governance by reducing incentives for careful moral reflection. The challenge becomes even more pronounced in contemporary contexts where political action increasingly requires coordination across multiple institutional levels and geographic boundaries. Global challenges like climate change, nuclear proliferation, and economic inequality require collective action on a scale that exceeds the capacity of any single political authority. Yet the moral frameworks we have inherited from earlier periods of human history provide little guidance for evaluating moral responsibility in such complex collective contexts. Insights suggest that effective responses to these challenges will require a new generation of political leaders willing to accept moral complexity and embrace tragic choices. Such leaders must be prepared to advocate for policies that impose immediate costs on their own citizens for the sake of long-term global welfare, to support international interventions that violate principles of sovereignty for humanitarian purposes, and to accept personal moral compromise as the price of collective moral progress. The cultivation of such leadership requires fundamental changes in how we educate future political leaders and how we evaluate their performance once in office. Instead of training leaders to articulate moral principles with maximum clarity and consistency, we must help them develop the intellectual and emotional capacities necessary for navigating moral complexity. Instead of judging leaders primarily by their adherence to campaign promises or ideological platforms, we must develop more sophisticated metrics for evaluating their contribution to long-term human welfare. This reorientation does not require abandoning moral standards, but making them more sophisticated and realistic. It means recognizing that the highest form of moral leadership may involve accepting personal moral costs for the sake of collective benefit, and that the appearance of moral purity may sometimes mask a deeper moral failure to accept responsibility for preventable suffering. The implications extend beyond formal political leadership to include the moral responsibilities of ordinary citizens in democratic societies. If we accept that effective governance sometimes requires morally problematic actions, then citizens who demand that their leaders maintain perfect moral purity may be complicit in preventing the kinds of decisive action necessary to address serious collective challenges. Democratic citizenship, from this perspective, requires not just the ability to identify and punish moral failures in leadership, but also the wisdom to recognize when apparent moral compromises serve legitimate public purposes. Citizens must be prepared to support leaders who make difficult decisions in good faith, even when those decisions violate their preferred moral principles, while remaining vigilant against leaders who use the complexity of governance as cover for self-interested behavior. This balance requires a level of moral sophistication that may exceed what we can reasonably expect from mass democratic electorates. The cognitive and emotional demands of evaluating complex moral trade-offs in political contexts are substantial, particularly when combined with the information processing challenges posed by modern media environments. Citizens must somehow distinguish between legitimate moral compromise and illegitimate moral corruption, while possessing limited information about the full context of political decisions. These limitations suggest that democratic societies may need to develop new institutional mechanisms for facilitating more sophisticated moral discourse about political challenges. Rather than treating moral and practical considerations as separate domains, we need forums for public deliberation that integrate ethical reflection with empirical analysis of policy alternatives. Rather than encouraging citizens to view political choices in terms of simple moral binaries, we need educational approaches that prepare people to engage constructively with moral complexity. The alternative, continuing to demand impossible moral purity from political leaders while remaining unwilling to accept the tragic dimensions of governance, promises only continued political dysfunction and moral confusion. When leaders are forced to choose between maintaining their public moral reputation and taking effective action to address serious problems, the incentive structure encourages symbolic gestures over substantive solutions and rhetoric over results. This dynamic helps explain many of the pathologies that characterize contemporary democratic politics, from the tendency toward polarization and demonization of political opponents, to the prevalence of policies that provide symbolic satisfaction while failing to address underlying problems. When political success requires maintaining an appearance of moral purity, leaders have strong incentives to avoid the kinds of morally complex decisions that effective governance requires. The solution lies not in abandoning moral standards, but in developing more mature and realistic approaches to moral evaluation in political contexts. This means accepting that the highest form of political virtue may involve willingness to sacrifice personal moral standing for collective benefit, and that the appearance of moral compromise may sometimes indicate moral courage rather than moral failure. Such a reorientation would represent a return to some of the deepest insights of classical political philosophy, while adapting them to contemporary democratic contexts. Ancient thinkers like Aristotle and Cicero understood that political virtue required different qualities than private virtue, and that effective statesmanship demanded the integration of moral wisdom with practical judgment in ways that admitted no simple formulas or universal rules. Modern democratic theory, in its understandable desire to establish clear principles for limiting governmental power and protecting individual rights, has sometimes lost sight of these classical insights about the complexity of political virtue. The result has been a form of political moralism that demands impossible standards while providing little guidance for navigating the tragic choices that governance inevitably requires. Recovering a more realistic understanding of political virtue does not mean abandoning the moral progress that democratic societies have achieved in areas like human rights, equality, and social justice. Rather, it means recognizing that the consolidation and extension of such progress may require forms of political leadership that accept moral complexity rather than seeking moral purity. The leaders who successfully extended democratic rights to previously excluded groups, who built international institutions capable of preventing global catastrophes, and who managed peaceful transitions from authoritarian to democratic governance, rarely achieved these outcomes through simple adherence to abstract moral principles. They succeeded because they understood how to integrate moral aspirations with practical necessities in ways that advanced human welfare while accepting personal moral costs. This understanding becomes particularly crucial as democratic societies face new challenges that require unprecedented forms of collective action. Climate change, technological disruption, demographic transition, and economic inequality all present problems that cannot be solved through existing institutional arrangements or conventional policy approaches. Addressing these challenges will require political leaders willing to advocate for policies that impose short-term costs for long-term benefits, that redistribute resources across geographic and generational boundaries, and that limit individual freedoms for collective purposes. The moral frameworks that served earlier generations of democratic leaders may prove inadequate for these new challenges, which require thinking on temporal and spatial scales that exceed normal human psychological capacities. Preventing climate catastrophe requires accepting immediate economic costs to prevent harms that may not fully manifest for decades. Managing technological change requires regulating innovations whose full consequences cannot be predicted in advance. Addressing inequality requires policies that may reduce the welfare of some citizens to improve conditions for others. These challenges share the characteristic that they require political leaders to make decisions based on incomplete information, while bearing responsibility for consequences that extend far beyond their personal experience or immediate constituency. They exemplify the tragic dimension of political leadership that identified the necessity of acting decisively in situations where all available options involve significant moral costs, and where inaction itself represents a form of moral choice. The contemporary relevance of insights extends beyond formal political leadership to encompass the broader challenge of moral reasoning in complex institutional contexts. Corporate executives, nonprofit leaders, academic administrators, and other institutional actors face similar dilemmas when they must balance competing moral claims while bearing responsibility for organizational outcomes that affect large numbers of people. The executive who must choose between maintaining employment for existing workers and investing in automation that will increase long-term organizational sustainability faces a version of the same tragic choice that confronts political leaders. The nonprofit director who must allocate limited resources between immediate service provision and long-term capacity building confronts similar tensions between competing moral imperatives. The academic leader who must balance intellectual freedom against community safety concerns navigates moral complexity that admits no simple resolution. In each of these contexts, the demand for moral purity may prevent the kinds of difficult decisions that effective institutional leadership requires. Leaders who are unwilling to accept moral complexity may find themselves paralyzed by competing claims, unable to make the decisive choices necessary to advance their organization's mission. Alternatively, they may retreat into rigid adherence to abstract principles that provide the appearance of moral consistency, while ignoring the practical consequences of their decisions. The cultivation of institutional leadership capable of navigating moral complexity requires fundamental changes in how we prepare people for positions of responsibility and how we evaluate their performance once in such positions. Professional education programs must move beyond technical skill development to include serious engagement with moral philosophy and practical ethics. Performance evaluation systems must develop more sophisticated metrics for assessing the moral dimension of leadership decisions, rather than focusing narrowly on short-term outcomes or procedural compliance. These changes require recognizing that moral leadership in institutional contexts is not simply a matter of following rules or maximizing certain values, but of developing judgment about how to integrate multiple moral considerations in specific situations that may not fit existing frameworks. This kind of practical wisdom cannot be reduced to algorithmic procedures, but requires the kind of experiential learning and reflective practice that characterizes the highest forms of professional expertise. The broader cultural implications of taking insights seriously extend to how we think about moral education and character development more generally. If effective leadership sometimes requires accepting moral compromise, then moral education must prepare people not just to identify and follow moral principles, but to navigate situations where moral principles conflict or where following principles may lead to harmful consequences. This does not mean teaching moral relativism or cynical pragmatism, but rather developing more sophisticated capacities for moral reasoning that can accommodate complexity and tragedy. Students need to learn how to think about moral problems that admit no perfect solutions, how to evaluate competing moral claims when resources are scarce, and how to accept responsibility for decisions that involve genuine moral costs. Such an approach would represent a significant departure from moral education, approaches that focus primarily on clarifying values, identifying moral rules, or developing empathetic responses to moral situations. While these elements remain important, they must be supplemented with training in moral reasoning that prepares people for the kinds of tragic choices that characterize many important decisions in adult life. The resistance to such approaches often stems from legitimate concerns about moral relativism or the erosion of moral standards. Critics worry that acknowledging moral complexity may lead to the abandonment of moral principles altogether, creating a slippery slope toward nihilism or opportunism. These concerns deserve serious consideration, particularly given the human tendency to rationalize self-interested behavior through appeals to moral complexity. Yet the alternative, maintaining moral education approaches that ignore the tragic dimension of many moral choices, may ultimately prove more dangerous to moral standards than honest engagement with moral complexity. When people encounter real-world situations that don't fit the simple moral frameworks they have learned, they may conclude that moral reasoning itself is useless rather than recognizing that their moral education was incomplete. The key lies in developing approaches to moral reasoning that acknowledge complexity while maintaining commitment to fundamental moral values. This means teaching people to distinguish between situations where moral principles provide clear guidance and situations where moral principles conflict or prove insufficient. It means developing capacities for moral judgment that can operate effectively in ambiguous situations while remaining anchored in core moral commitments. Own approach provides a useful model for this kind of sophisticated moral reasoning. His analysis never abandoned moral categories, but rather explored how moral considerations must be integrated with practical necessities in specific political contexts. He maintained that cruelty, deception, and violence remain genuine evils, while arguing that these evils might sometimes be necessary to prevent greater evils or achieve essential goods. This perspective requires what might be called moral courage, the willingness to accept personal moral costs for the sake of larger moral purposes. Such courage differs both from the heroic virtue celebrated in conventional moral narratives and from the pragmatic calculation emphasized in purely consequentialist approaches to ethics. It involves accepting moral responsibility for harmful actions, while maintaining commitment to the moral principles that make such actions genuinely tragic rather than merely unfortunate. The development of such moral courage requires not just intellectual understanding, but also emotional and spiritual preparation for the burden of moral responsibility. Leaders who must make tragic choices need support systems that help them maintain moral perspective while accepting moral compromise. They need frameworks for moral reflection that acknowledge the genuine costs of their decisions while affirming the moral importance of the outcomes they achieve. Religious and philosophical traditions have historically provided such frameworks, offering concepts like moral tragedy, necessary evil, and the lesser of two evils that help people navigate situations where moral principles conflict. Contemporary secular approaches to ethics have sometimes lost sight of these concepts in their emphasis on finding moral solutions that avoid genuine tragedy. Recovering these older insights while adapting them to contemporary contexts may be essential for developing the kinds of moral leadership that current challenges require. This means acknowledging that some moral problems admit no satisfactory solutions, that effective action sometimes requires accepting genuine moral costs, and that the highest forms of moral courage may involve sacrificing personal moral purity for collective moral progress. The implications of this perspective extend to how we think about moral progress itself. Standard narratives of moral progress tend to emphasize the gradual expansion of moral consideration to previously excluded groups and the development of institutions that better protect individual rights and promote human welfare. These narratives typically assume that moral progress involves overcoming tragic choices rather than learning to navigate them more wisely. Insights suggest a different understanding of moral progress, one that emphasizes the development of more sophisticated capacities for moral reasoning rather than the elimination of moral conflict. From this perspective, moral progress involves learning to make tragic choices more wisely rather than finding ways to avoid them altogether. This alternative understanding of moral progress helps explain some apparent paradoxes in moral history. Why have some of the most morally advanced societies also been capable of extraordinary moral failures? Why do increases in moral sensitivity sometimes lead to political paralysis rather than moral action? Why do the most morally committed individuals sometimes prove least effective at achieving moral reforms? These patterns make sense if we recognize that moral progress requires not just clearer moral vision, but also better practical judgment about how moral aspirations can be effectively realized in complex social contexts. The most morally advanced societies may be those that have developed the most sophisticated capacities for navigating moral complexity, rather than those that have achieved the greatest moral purity. Such an understanding suggests that contemporary discussions of moral progress may benefit from greater attention to the practical dimensions of moral reasoning, rather than focusing exclusively on the clarification of moral principles or the expansion of moral concern. We need better understanding of how moral aspirations can be effectively translated into institutional arrangements, policy outcomes, and behavioral changes that actually improve human welfare. This practical focus does not diminish the importance of moral principles, but rather emphasizes the complex challenges involved in applying those principles to specific historical situations. The gap between moral aspiration and practical achievement represents not a failure of moral reasoning, but an inherent feature of moral life in a complex world. Bridging this gap requires the integration of moral reflection with empirical analysis, policy expertise, and practical wisdom that in his best work. It requires moral leaders who can maintain commitment to fundamental moral values while developing sophisticated judgment about how those values can be most effectively promoted in specific contexts. The contemporary challenges facing democratic societies provide numerous examples of situations where such integrated moral reasoning is essential. Consider the challenge of immigration policy, which requires balancing humanitarian obligations to refugees and asylum seekers against practical concerns about economic impacts, cultural integration, and political stability. Pure moral approaches that ignore practical constraints may lead to policies that are unsustainable and ultimately counterproductive, while purely practical approaches that ignore moral obligations may violate fundamental human dignity. Effective immigration policy requires leaders who can integrate moral commitments with practical analysis in ways that advance humanitarian goals while maintaining political viability. This integration cannot be achieved through simple formulas, but requires contextual judgment about what moral aspirations are achievable given specific political and economic constraints. Similar challenges arise in areas like criminal justice reform, environmental protection, and economic policy, where moral goals must be pursued through institutional mechanisms that operate according to their own complex logics. The leader who ignores these institutional constraints in pursuit of moral purity may achieve symbolic victories while failing to advance substantive moral progress. The leader who accepts these constraints as unchangeable may achieve incremental progress while failing to address fundamental moral problems. The path forward requires what's called the integration of moral understanding with practical effectiveness, a form of leadership that neither sacrifices moral principle for practical gain nor pursues moral purity at the expense of practical achievement. Such leadership represents not the abandonment of moral standards, but their refinement and deepening through engagement with the complex realities of political action. This integration becomes particularly crucial as societies face challenges that require unprecedented forms of collective action across traditional boundaries of nation, culture, and generation. Addressing global challenges like climate change, nuclear proliferation, and technological disruption requires moral leadership that can maintain commitment to universal human values while navigating the complex realities of international relations, cultural difference, and political competition. The leaders who successfully meet these challenges will likely be those who can accept the tragic dimensions of political action while maintaining hope for moral progress. They will understand that serving universal human interests sometimes requires accepting particular costs, that achieving long-term moral goals may require short-term moral compromises, and that the highest form of moral leadership may involve sacrificing personal moral standing for collective moral advancement. Such leadership represents not a departure from moral tradition, but a return to its deepest insights about the complexity of moral life and the difficulty of translating moral aspirations into practical achievements. It embodies the tragic wisdom that recognizes both the necessity and the cost of political action in a world where human interests conflict and moral principles provide incomplete guidance for resolving complex social problems. The cultivation of such leadership remains one of the most important challenges facing contemporary democratic societies. It requires educational institutions that prepare future leaders for moral complexity, political systems that reward practical wisdom over ideological purity, and civic cultures that can appreciate the difference between moral failure and moral tragedy. Most fundamentally, it requires citizens who can distinguish between leaders who sacrifice moral principle for personal gain and leaders who accept personal moral costs for collective benefit. This distinction cannot be made through simple observation of leaders' actions, but requires sophisticated understanding of the contexts in which those actions occur and the alternative courses of action that were available. The development of such sophisticated civic judgment represents perhaps the ultimate challenge posed by insights. If effective governance sometimes requires moral compromise, then democratic accountability requires citizens capable of evaluating such compromises intelligently rather than simply condemning them reflexively. Meeting this challenge may determine whether democratic societies prove capable of addressing the complex moral and practical problems they face in an interconnected and rapidly changing world. The alternative, continued insistence on impossible moral purity from political leaders, promises continued political dysfunction and the gradual erosion of democratic effectiveness in addressing serious collective challenges. The stakes could not be higher. The future of democratic governance may depend on whether citizens and leaders can develop the moral sophistication necessary to navigate the tragic dimensions of political life, while maintaining commitment to the moral aspirations that give democratic societies their ultimate justification. This represents not the abandonment of moral idealism, but its maturation through engagement with the complex realities of human nature and political action. In the end, insights force us to confront fundamental questions about what we expect from political leadership and what we owe to future generations who will inherit the consequences of our political choices. His work suggests that the highest form of political virtue may require accepting moral burdens that allow others to maintain their moral innocence, and that the greatest service to moral progress may sometimes involve actions that appear to violate moral principles. This understanding offers no easy comfort to those who seek simple answers to complex moral questions. It provides no escape from the difficult work of moral reasoning and practical judgment that effective citizenship and leadership require. What it does offer is a more realistic foundation for thinking about moral responsibility in political contexts, one that acknowledges both the importance of moral aspiration and the complexity of its practical realization. Choice facing contemporary democratic societies is not between moral idealism and cynical pragmatism, but between sophisticated moral reasoning that can navigate complexity and simplistic approaches that provide the illusion of moral clarity while failing to address genuine moral problems. Insights remain relevant precisely because they point toward forms of moral and political wisdom that neither ignore moral considerations nor treat them as simple solutions to complex problems. The brutal cost of goodness that identified is not a price we can avoid paying, but one we must learn to pay more wisely. The alternative is not moral purity, but moral irrelevance, the preservation of individual virtue at the expense of collective welfare, and the maintenance of moral principles that fail to guide effective action in the complex world we actually inhabit. This recognition does not represent the end of moral aspiration, but its beginning under more realistic conditions. It opens the possibility for forms of moral progress that acknowledge the tragic dimensions of human existence while maintaining commitment to reducing unnecessary suffering and promoting human flourishing within the constraints imposed by human nature and political reality. The leaders who embody this more mature form of moral commitment will face loneliness, misunderstanding, and moral burden that those who maintain their purity by avoiding difficult choices will never experience. Yet they may also achieve forms of moral service that are unavailable to those who refuse to engage with moral complexity. Their sacrifice may be the price of moral progress in a world where good intentions alone prove insufficient to address the challenges facing human societies. Understanding this sacrifice does not require celebrating it or minimizing its costs. It does require recognizing that the alternative, insisting on moral purity while avoiding moral responsibility, may represent a more profound form of moral failure than the tragic choices that effective leadership sometimes requires. The brutal cost of goodness may be the price of living in a world where moral ideals must be pursued through imperfect institutions, by fallible human beings, who nonetheless bear responsibility for outcomes that extend far beyond their personal experience or direct control.